to Poetics, a podcast exploring the heart of verse and the creative spirit. Along with my husband, Ben, I've been running Bainbridge Island Press, our poetry publishing house, here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest for the past few years. If you've been following along with this podcast, then you know that we've published 9 collections so far, and they just come from such powerful voices, of local voices to international anthologies that span the globe. These past 2 years have just been the most wonderful journey through the world of poetry, and we've been fortunate to go to book festivals, to intimate readings, have conversations with incredible poets at every stage in their creative path. And so we're so excited to have episode 6 of our podcast. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and join us as we dive into the world of poetry. Welcome to Poetics. So today, I am going to be reading Sharon Olds' poetry. And it took me a little while to understand Sharon Olds, because when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, it didn't speak to me. And this is the thing with poetry. This is the thing with any art, with anything, I think. But as we grow in life, as we have new seasons in our life, as we change it as people during our life, there's different things that will resonate with us. And so when you come back to a book 20 years after you read it when you were in high school, you're like, oh, wow, there is so much more nuance that I was unaware of, and I understand it better. And actually, that was something, I mean, I can name like a million things that have happened in my life where that has been the case. Catcher in the Rye, I read when I was 15. I'm like, oh, well, that was interesting. And then you read it later and you're like, oh, that was interesting. So different ways of interpreting. But even when I was graduating with my undergrad in a state university, which was wonderful university, and some of the most incredible classes I've taken in literature. That was at Cal State East Bay. It used to be Cal State Hayward, and I was the last class to have that, and then they changed the name to expand it, which makes sense, and I'm very happy for them. It was just wonderful, wonderful programs, and some of my favorite professors and lecturers are still there. But I graduated with my BA in American and English literature, and I'm like, I think I can just apply to a master's program. And so I did, and I got in, which was wonderful. And all of a sudden, it was the first semester, and I don't remember what book it was, but we were reading something, and all of a sudden I realized that I had no idea what the book was talking about, because I was 23 or 24, and I hadn't lived. I hadn't experienced things. I hadn't experienced the depth of grief required for some of this literature. I was married at the time, still married, but I hadn't had children. I hadn't traveled. I hadn't had experiences that would allow me to understand the literature at the depth that I wanted to. And so I quit the master's program because I wanted to understand it better. But in order to do that, I had to live, and I had to go out. I had to talk to people. I had to make enemies. I had to make friends. I had to fall in love with things. And that's what I did for, 10 years or so. Probably, if you did the math, it was probably not 10 years. It's probably a little bit more than 10 years. But that was something that I needed to do, because when I did go back to the master's program, I was accepted into Harvard for that one, and also very lovely school, very lovely school. But all of a sudden, when I came to the literature, I'm like, oh, that's what they're talking about. And I was just able to understand it. And I feel the same experience with Sharon Olds, because I remember there was a poem that she wrote about the wrinkled skin between her breasts. And I think I read that when I was like 27, and I wasn't ready to get old yet. And I'm like, I'm not ready. Just put it down. And I went back to reading her a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my goodness. Oh, what she's writing about is so lovely and so real. And all of a sudden I know what she's feeling. So I would like to explore this. Now, the thing is, the book that she wrote, she's written quite a few books, but the one that she wrote that I have gone to 5 million times is called Stag's Leap. And I have a lot of emotional attachment to this book because on one hand, Stag's Leap was our favorite wine for a long, long time. And so that was just nice. I know it's the cover of the book, but I liked it. And then when I read the first page, I'm only going to be reading the first poem in this book. But to me, when I read this poem, it feels like she is opening the narrative for the audience. Now, before I get into that, there are different things. There's different ways to read a poem. You can read a poem that you've written. You understand the references and the metaphors and the groundwork and the framework and the history, and you're like, I know where that toadstool was. I know where that, tree was. And so when you read your own poem, it means something to you because you are bringing your tool bag of life and experiences to that poem that you wrote, and you understand it. When you give your poem to a reader, they are bringing their own tool bag of life and experiences. And so when they read it, it's going to be different for them, and they are going to have a different emotional experience than you have, even though you wrote it. And so even though I understand that she wrote this book of poetry that was about the tragic divorce that she had with her husband, that's what the book is about. It's about her divorce. But when I read it, I'm reading it from my perspective. And so there's a duality in reading, and you must have a plurality of understanding, especially when you're reading poetry. And so you can understand both these things at the same time. But with this poem, it feels like she is showing you something. She's showing you a scene and saying, this is the poem, and I'm going to break it apart for you. And the emotions will come, but you will be bringing them. And it feels like she is allowing us to bring ourselves into this scene that she has created for us. I hope that makes sense. It's very lovely. So the poem that I am reading today is called While He Told Me. It is the first poem in her book called Stag's Leap. And here we go. While he told me. While he told me, I looked from small thing to small thing in our room, the face of the bedside clock, the sepia postcard of a woman bending down to a lily. Later, when we took off our clothes, I saw his deep navel and the cindery lichen skin between the male breasts, and from outside the shower curtains, terrible membrane, I called out something like flirting to him, and he smiled. Before I turned out the light, he touched my face, then turned away, then the dark. Then every scene I thought of, I visited, accompanied by a death spirit. Everything was chilled with it. Every time I woke, I lay in dreading bliss to feel and hear him sigh and snore. Near sunrise, behind overcast, he got up to go in and read on the couch, as he often did. And in a while, I followed him, as I often had, and snoozed on him while he read, and he laid an arm across my back. When I opened my eyes, I saw 2 tulips stretched away from each other, extreme in the old vase with the grotto carved out of a hill and a person in it, underground, praying, my imagined shepherd in make-believe paradise. This scene is when he told her that he wanted a divorce, and it feels peaceful. There was not a lot of action. She didn't move across the scene. She didn't play. We don't know where her hands were. We don't know where her feet were. We don't know where his fists were. There was no body. We weren't looking at her body. We weren't looking at his body. And we were looking at the house around them that they had built together. And that is one perspective that you can use when writing poetry. So when the poem begins, it says, while he told me, so that's a place and time, I looked from small thing to small thing in our room, the face of the bedside clock, the sepia postcard of a woman bending down to a lily. And that places us in the room with them. And we are experiencing this moment with them. And when you are in an uncomfortable conversation, you tend to look at something close to you. You don't tend to look someone, maybe you do, I don't. I would find something in my fingernails to pick at. I would look at the carpet. I would look at the end table. Something, the corner of the room. And that distraction, that need for escape is the first thing, the first emotion that she draws in, is she is in an uncomfortable conversation and she's trying to escape. And that's how this poem begins. And that's how this book begins. And after those lines, we follow her through the day where he takes a shower and they have their normal routines, and he reads on the couch and she takes a nap on the couch. And when she wakes up, she sees a vase with 2 tulips stretched away from each other in extreme on the old vase with the grotto carved out of the hill. And then at the end of the poem, she identifies with this little person who's underground praying in this little make-believe paradise. And that is what I really like about this poem, is she is allowing the reader to see her emotional experience without telling you. This is what showing, not telling, means, is she's using objects to tell the story, and then the reader is allowed to create the story themselves. And that's what is very important about figurative language, is it is not an essay. You are not ending the poem with a conclusion. This is not a thesis. And I'm only saying that because I tend to think about whenever I'm writing a poem, and it's an essay and I need to have a conclusion. And because I don't want there to be ambiguity, I want it to be clear. But at the same time, this poetry is a different form of literature. And so we are allowed to use the ancient language of poetry to say, this means something, and this symbol means something. Why was she describing her husband naked in the shower? It's because he's vulnerable. He is not hiding himself from her. When she laid on him on the couch and fell asleep, that is a vulnerable position. And he put his arm across her back. There's no violence and there's no hostility. And this scene is showing that they were in love and there was love there. And the fact that it's gone is that much more devastating and heartbreaking and tragic. But also at the end, the very end line with my imagined shepherd in make-believe paradise, she's realizing that she didn't know it was not going to last forever. And that surprise is heartbreaking beyond. How do you handle that? And it's the beginning of grief is acknowledging something terrible, something heartbreaking, something sad. The reason why I like poetry is because the poet is creating something for the reader to access so that we can understand ourselves better. I have been sad before. I'm a poet. Of course, I've been sad. I might have been mopey. And what this poem does specifically is it is creating a scene where it is showing you a sad scene. And now the reader is allowed to experience their sadness in a safe space. And that is why it's important, is because I've felt sad before. And when I read this, now I feel sad for her, but I also am sad for my own reasons. The sadness that I have is touching on experiences that I have had. And now I get to process how I feel and why I felt it. And I could even go back through experiences that I've had where I've been sad and in this format of what did I do when I was in that room, when they told me something that was sad. How did I react? Was it the same loving vulnerability, or did I react in a hostile way? What language did I use? If I used any language at all, how did my body react to the sadness? And this poem is allowing me to be introspective and think about the sadness that I have had. And it's a safe space to do that. Poetry is very lovely because it is very giving and very generous. And the poet is generous with creating these spaces. So I encourage you to find this book and read it. The whole book is just lovely. And take some time to think about yourself, especially during, this time in my life. I just have so much experience, and it is lovely to have literature walk me through how I feel. There's friends, there's family that also do this, but when you're alone, I think that that is a function of literature, and I hope that that all made sense. Thank you so much for listening to my poetry ideas. I really appreciate it. Okay, party people. If you've enjoyed diving into the world of verse with us, please join us next time. We've got more poets to meet, more poems to explore, and more literary adventures to share. Until then, keep reading, keep writing, and keep poetry close to your heart. Thank you for joining POETICS Podcast, where we bring poetry to life, one verse at a time.